The 1920s in U.S. history is a decade with many nicknames. Perhaps the most common is the Roaring Twenties. But there are other nicknames, such as the Jazz Age or the Age of Ballyhoo. But regardless of what you call this decade, it signals a fundamental shift in American life and culture. Many argued that the 1920s represents the beginning of modern American culture and life. So speaking of Life, one of the most popular periodicals of the day was Life magazine, and this is the cover on July the 1st, 1926. The caption in the main article at the bottom reads, as I have captioned here on the right, 143 years of liberty and 7 years of prohibition. And you can see there the jazz, you can see the short dresses, the flapper image, you can see prohibition, and the motto of the year, the spirit of 26. But as there are many things changing in American life and culture, there is also much resistance, and the 1920s is also about that. The 1920s is also about an age where the U.S. had emerged from World War I with a lot of nationalism and a lot of economic prosperity. But these things are going to fall on their head with the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that follows. So some guiding questions for you to think about as I go through the 1920s and as you follow along with your own outlines and your own readings. What aspects of life created the reputation of the Roaring Twenties? In what ways and to what degree were the 1920s a period of tension between the new and changing attitudes on the one hand and the traditional values on the other? And finally, in what ways did economic conditions and developments in the arts and entertainment help create the reputation of the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties? I just wanted to give you a quick insight into the reason why I posted a couple of these questions. The second and the third questions were both essay questions on the AP US exam. The second one was way back in 1986, the actual DBQ, and some of the things that it expected you to talk about in the rubric for this question were race relations, immigration, nativism, the role of women in entertainment, and consumerism. The third question was the 1999 free response question. These are the types of questions you need to think about as you process this information to be able to synthesize it into a coherent answer filled with evidence about the 1920s. So let's first talk about business prosperity. As I mentioned before, coming out of World War I, the United States was at an all-time high in nationalism and also economic prosperity. Many of the inventions and technology that had originally begun with the Second Great Awakening now had reached the middle class. And there was, in fact, the creation of a middle class. But there also was a growing divide between the wealthy and the poor. Productivity was up 50%. The income of the average American was up 25%. Some of the standards of living, particularly, I asked the question where, but particularly in the Northeast, indoor plumbing, central heat, and 2/3 of Americans had electricity by 1930. Some of the causes of this business prosperity, as I mentioned, the Second Industrial Revolution, and some of the things that come out of that. Scientific discovery, inventions, think about Edison, for example, new machinery, oil, electricity, and, as I also mentioned, favorable government policies, tax breaks, and there are some antitrust laws, but there are certainly also big businesses. Speaking of big business, one of the biggest that emerged in the 1920s was the automobile industry. And this is part of the industrial expansion that you see in the United States during this period from 1910 to 1930. If you look in the small box there, in 1913 a car cost 2 years worth of wages. By 1929, 3 months of those wages. In 1913 it took 14 hours to build a new car. In 1928 a new Ford rolled off the assembly line every 10 seconds. Henry Ford was the mastermind behind the assembly line, but also was able to benefit from industrial innovation. Fordism, as it is sometimes known, was named obviously after Henry Ford and is less about Ford as an entrepreneur or Ford as a brand, and rather about the idea, a philosophy of modern economics and a social system that's based on industrial mass production. It has a lot of different meanings. Some even attach Marxist prerogatives to Fordism. But in the Fordist system, the worker was paid relatively high wages. Ford made sure of this in order to buy, in return, products created by other American manufacturers. Of course, Henry Ford also wanted all of his employees to buy his own cars, too. So this idea of greater wages, then in some ways, as Ford saw it, you pay people greater wages, but then they will turn around and put more money into the economy by buying consumer goods. Just for you to get a glimpse, to catch a glimpse of auto manufacturing, you can see the major cities and areas that are producing auto parts, materials, and vehicles. Michigan is one that we all know, but also Ohio, California, and New York. These are still known as heavily industrialized states, and some of which, especially Ohio and Michigan, who have suffered greatly, partly because of the demise of the auto industry and its shift to overseas. There are also problems in the workplace. Many unions, we talked a lot about in the Gilded and Progressive era, we talked a lot about unions and strikes. Well, unions actually lose their prominence after World War I. Many big businesses encourage open shops, which means that they only want to hire people who are not members of unions, or they want to make unions much smaller, and instead of them being based on your job, them being based on the company that you work for. But that way, the CEOs of these companies can better control the union's activity if they are just within the company. And then finally, injunctions, which means the ability of the government to step in and stop unfair business practices. Welfare capitalism is another concept that we talked about, where many businesses actually began to offer benefits in order to encourage workers to stay with the company, to not join other unions, and to maximize their productivity. They were first led by railroads, and then with companies such as the Pullman Car Company, Standard Oil, and then later Ford Motor Company followed, and U.S. Steel. But they began to provide numerous services to their employees: paid vacations, medical benefits, pensions, and even recreational facilities on site. They were called welfare capitalism and came as a result of World War I in an effort to reduce the tension between labor and business through private corporate offerings of benefits. And they particularly aimed these benefits and offered these benefits to non-union workers. What they were trying to do was, the businessmen themselves were trying to internally solve this problem of where people didn't want to join unions. Instead, they wanted to work for their businesses because, regardless of whether they could join a union, because of the benefits that they offered. The economic upheaval of the Great Depression in the 1930s brought many of these programs to a halt, and employers cut cultural activities and stopped building recreational facilities as they struggled themselves just to stay in business. It wasn't until after World War II that most of these programs, particularly insurance and medical benefits, reappeared and expanded to more blue-collar workers. But that idea of welfare capitalism is an important one. So overall, most workers are fairly insecure in their employment, and they are once again beholden to the big business powers. Just to let you know, by 1929, here is the gap between the wealthy and the poor. 40% of all U.S. families lived on less than $1,500 a year, which was in the poverty range. I know $1,500 a year sounds like not very much at all today, but even for that time period, $1,500 was within or close to the poverty range. The 1% is this top color here, the $10,000 plus. So if you add all of these up, what is particularly striking is that even with the current even when looking at the current economic situation, you can see that history is repeating itself, or at least the pattern. This pie graph could very well easily be translated to today's in terms of the 99% Occupy Wall Street movement versus the top 1%. These problems are not just for urban workers, but also for farmers. Farming had been helped by the second industrial revolution, and they could be more productive. But in some ways, that wasn't good. They could be more productive, but their incomes were actually going down. You can see a picture there of the new McCormick tractor and plow. But you can see from 1900 to 1929, it took 90 minutes using 5 horses. 1929, 30 minutes using a 27 horsepower tractor. And by 2000, just 10, 12 years ago, 5 minutes using a 154 horsepower tractor. And again, 1890s, it took 40 to 50 labor hours to produce 100 bushels of wheat, and this is going to go down to 15 or 20 labor hours. So the farm owner might be still doing okay, but all the farm laborers are not doing very well because there is not as much work for them to do now that you have more machines in the Midwest in the breadbasket. This era, though, is also about the loss of the farm in American prestige. The 19-teens and 20s is where you really see this movement towards the cities. And this is just a chart showing you that based on when transcontinental railroads are finished and then the beginning of the auto tractor and the truck boom, you can see the farm to non-farm population. So by 1920, it's the first time that the majority of the U.S. population lived in urban areas. To do a little comparison here to show you how quickly these cities are growing, the 10 largest cities in 1900 and then in 1930. For example, New York is going to nearly double its population. So is Chicago is going to more than double its population, and Philadelphia. But you also see even smaller cities like a Cincinnati or a Cleveland that are doubling, sorry, not Cincinnati, but Cleveland that is doubling its doubling in this time period. And you also see some that are going to fall off the list, like Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh is actually going to go down a little bit, and St. Louis is going to go down. So the nature of cities and their population are changing. So as I mentioned earlier, this period shows the changing nature of American life. In many documentaries that you see portray this time period, you see all of the new appliances that are now affordable for the middle class, including not only automobiles, of course, but washing machines and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners and stoves and canned goods. As one of my favorite phrases, breakfast now came in a box. And with that, you have the creation of an entirely new industry, advertising. And advertising becomes its own huge industry. And a second industry that had always existed but takes on a whole new meaning is the credit industry. Before, you opened up a credit account with your local store, and at the end of the month you had to pay up or they'd cut your credit off. And now you start having credit agencies. This, of course, will lead to the almost unbridled use of the credit card from the 1920s up until today. And then finally, chain stores and brand names is something else that emerges out of this consumerist culture. And then finally, just to show you how automobiles are going to take over from railroads. You look at the surface road amount. In many pictures and primary sources, you'll see that paved roads came with automobiles and also filling stations. But look at that skyrocketing curve, and then look at the sharp decline as far as how people are traveling. Okay, we'll take a time out, and I'll come back in a second.